Located on the border between California and Nevada is a well-known area known as the Death Valley National Park. The area got its name from a group of pioneers who had gotten lost there for around 2 months and had assumed that they would die there, which isn't surprising considering that the valley can reach temperatures of over 50 degrees Celsius. Today's story is located in a separated part of the park known as the Ash Meadows National Refuge, which is on the Nevada side of the divide. The refuge is home to a geothermal pool which is connected to an underwater cave system called the Devil's Hole, named so by experienced cave diver Jim Hout in 1964, after he had conducted several dives into the limestone cavern. The water in the cave sits at around 33 degrees Celsius, which makes it the perfect temperature for skin diving, which is exactly what four young men had decided to do on the 20th of June 1965. The four men were high school friends: David Rose, 20, his new brother-in-law, Paul Giancontier, 19, and brothers Bill, 19, and Jack, 20. The four were amateur divers, but they had heard of this amazing underwater cave located about 90 miles outside of Vegas, where they lived, and decided that they just had to go and see it for themselves. So, on that warm Sunday night, they made the trip into the desert, and once they were close enough, they set out on foot towards the fenced-off area around the entrance to the cave. There were signs posted along the wire fence stating that divers were required to attain a permit to dive in the cave, but the four ignored this and excitedly made their way down to the geothermal pool. Once there, they got their gear ready, which would have just been simple aqualungs, fins, and flashlights. In the 60s, it was fairly common for divers to skin dive, which meant that they would not be wearing any sort of wetsuit and instead would just be diving in their normal swimwear. The warm water of Devil's Cave was perfect for this, and three of the men quickly lowered into the water, ready to explore the dark depths below them. One of the men, 20-year-old Jack, stayed up top to act as a lookout, and then he watched as his brother and two friends gave a quick thumbs up and then disappeared under the water. Once in the water, the three men swam along a diagonal chute that led down into pitch blackness. After a little while, they came to a narrow opening called the funnel, which they squeezed through, bringing them out into a large cavern known as a chasm. Bill, Paul and David dove down slowly now that they were in this vast space, unable to see the walls of the cave, the darkness around them broken only by the stream of light from their flashlights, and even that didn't reach very far ahead of them. They swam around for a while, exploring the cavern, until Bill noticed that his oxygen was getting low and it was time to head back up to the surface. The three signalled to each other and began their ascent. Bill squeezed his way back through the funnel and followed the diagonal limestone wall all the way up to the surface, where his brother Jack was waiting for him. David's head bobbed up from the water next, and they turned around in the water expecting Paul to emerge soon after. But he never did. After a brief discussion, David and Bill decided that they had to go back down and find their friend. The two friends dove back down into the pitch-black water, all the way back into a chasm. David, who had recently married Paul's sister, Paula, swam ahead, desperate to find his brother-in-law. He continued heading downwards, scanning the darkness with his flashlight, trying to catch a reflection of a dive mask or another light, but he found nothing. After a short time, Bill, who was following behind David, realised that they had very limited amount of oxygen and would soon have to abandon their search in favour of not making the situation any worse. He tried to get David's attention, to signal to him that it was time to head up, but it was no use. David continued to swim deeper. Bill would later say to reporters that he had tried to follow David, but at some point had lost him. He swam down to a depth of around 54 metres to look for him, but ultimately had to make the decision to leave two of his friends down in the cavern and return to the surface. When Bill resurfaced alone, Jack was waiting for him with a worried expression, and the two realised that they needed to get help. So they quickly made their way back into Vegas to raise the alarm. It took only a few hours for search and rescue to arrive on the scene, but by that point it was assumed that the two missing men had already perished. An experienced dive team, led by the person who had named the cave, Jim Hout, was assembled to look for the men, and they had very quickly come to the conclusion that the only way the two missing divers could have survived was if they had managed to swim into an area of Devil's Hold called Brown's Room, which was a small air pocket. An entrance to this area sat very close to the funnel that they had slipped through, and so it was possible that one or both of the men could have mistaken it for the exit. While the dive team searched underwater, relatives and friends of the missing men began to gather outside. This included Paula, David's wife and Paul's sister, who, along with her mother, prayed that the two would be found alive. Unfortunately, Hout's team found nothing in Brown's room and so had to switch their focus to the lower areas of the cave, now simply hoping that they could recover the bodies for the families. Houtz and his team dived down to the lower area of a Crease Chasm, which is a steep slope leading to a drop-off. They searched around this area and even dived down to a depth of 96 metres, but all they found was a flashlight attached to a rock, possibly as a marker, a single fin, and a dive mask that belonged to one of the missing men. The drop-off, which becomes a tunnel that is barely big enough for a diver on their gear to fit through, goes down to an unknown depth, but is thought to be at least 275 metres deep. A strong current can also be felt in the hole, which makes some think that it could be connected to some sort of far-reaching water system, an idea which was given merit in March 2012 when an earthquake in Mexico caused the water in the cave to rise and fall by 1.2 metres. The rescue mission was called off after 36 hours, and Devil's Hole would become the final resting place of David and Paul, as their bodies have never been found. As for what happened to them, cave diving is a very dangerous hobby, even for experienced divers, and it is incredibly easy to get turned around in the pitch black, take a wrong turn, or push through the wrong tunnel. Along with the simple fact that it is easy to get lost, once you reach a certain depth underwater, you'll start to be affected by something called nitrogen narcosis, which is essentially like being drunk. Nitrogen narcosis is something that even very experienced divers can have trouble with, as you may only have a couple of breaths to realise that something is wrong. David and Bill were definitely not experienced divers and should never have dived down to the depth that they did. At 54 metres, the depth that Bill and David had dived to while looking for Paul, they would have almost definitely begun to feel the effects of this, which would have been confusion, impaired judgment, and dizziness. This could be why David did not turn back with Bill, despite knowing that he didn't have enough oxygen to continue searching for Paul. It is also possible that at some point he may have even thought that he was swimming up to the surface, as it's not uncommon for those suffering from the effects of nitrogen narcosis to have trouble discerning up from down. As David continued to descend, it is likely that he would have started to experience memory loss, maybe even forgetting what he was doing and removing his mask, or simply falling unconscious and being pulled down by the current. Devil's Hole is now a restricted area and only accessible to those who are involved in the conservation of the Devil's Hole pupfish, which is an extremely rare fish found only in the waters of this cavern. And so, it is unlikely that any trace of David or Paul will ever be found. However, with the advances in technology since the 60s, maybe one day we will be able to see just how deep the cave goes and what lies at the bottom. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and leave any suggestions for future videos down in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you all again next time.